There is a room inside the Vatican that does not appear on any official floor plan. It is not the secret archive which scholars have accessed under controlled conditions for decades. It is not the Apostolic Library with its catalogued holdings and visiting hours. This room sits behind a different kind of lock, in a different kind of silence, and the handful of people who have stood inside it have signed agreements that run longer than most legal contracts. What sits inside that room includes documents so old and structurally fragile that light itself is considered a threat. Among them, according to 3 independent source testimonies gathered over 30 years of academic correspondence, is a bound manuscript dated to 1357. It arrived in Vatican possession sometime in the 15th century. Its origins before that are disputed. Its contents, however, are not entirely unknown. 3 folios within that manuscript mention, I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. By name, a civilization that mainstream history insists did not exist in any unified form. Those folios mention Tartaria, not as myth, not as geographic shorthand for a vague eastern territory, as an administrative entity, as a trading power, as a civilization with protocols, with recognized currency, with diplomatic correspondence that the manuscript's author treats as entirely ordinary. The author does not explain what Tartaria is because the author assumed the reader already knew. That assumption, preserved in ink on vellum for 668 years, tells you something that no textbook currently does. This is that story. If you have found this channel, you already suspect that the version of history taught in schools is not the complete version. You suspect that what gets left out is often more important than what gets included. If that suspicion has brought you here, consider subscribing. New investigations like this one go up regularly, and the comment section is where the most interesting conversations happen. Drop where you are watching from and what time it is. That small act of acknowledgement matters more than you might think. The manuscript is referred to in 3 separate pieces of secondary documentation as the Liber Correspondentiarum Orientalium, the Book of Eastern Correspondences. The title itself is significant. Correspondence implies exchange. Exchange implies 2 parties. 2 parties implies that whoever the Vatican-adjacent scribes of the 15th century were cataloguing, they recognized as a peer entity capable of formal communication. The East, in this context, is not merely a direction. It is a designation for a structured administrative system that operated under its own internal logic, its own financial instruments, and its own diplomatic calendar. The 3 folios that mention Tartaria by name appear in the 2nd quarter of the manuscript. Researchers who have seen partial transcriptions describe the 1st folio as a summary of trade route obligations. It uses language consistent with contract law, not geographic description. It refers to obligations owed, to timelines for settlement, and to penalties for non-delivery calculated against a standard of value that does not correspond to any currency officially recognized by European monetary systems of the 14th century. The standard of value appears to be indexed to a commodity, possibly grain or possibly a processed metal alloy that held consistent worth across a corridor stretching from what is now Western Russia through Central Asia and into territories that no current national boundary cleanly covers. The 2nd folio is more personal in tone. It reads, according to one partial transcription shared in a 1991 academic letter, like a letter of introduction. Someone is being vouched for, sent from one administrative centre to another, carrying credentials that will be recognised on arrival. The name of the sending authority contains the root word that scholars of revisionist cartography have spent decades arguing over. It is not spelled identically to modern transliterations of Tartaria, because orthography in 1357 was not standardized as it is today. But the route is there, the recognition is there, and the authority being invoked is treated as sufficient to guarantee safe passage and commercial access across a territory so large that the Folios author felt no need to specify its borders. Everyone involved already knew where it ended and where it began. The third folio is the one that most directly implicates the economic history that mainstream academia has spent considerable energy suppressing. It is, according to the same researcher correspondence, a partial accounting document. It lists transfers, obligations fulfilled and outstanding. It uses numerical notation that is neither Roman nor Arabic in the standard sense, but a hybrid system that appears in a small number of other documents from the same period, documents that have been quietly set aside rather than integrated into the accepted narrative of medieval commerce. The sums involved, when converted using the closest available equivalents, suggest a scale of economic activity that contradicts the standard picture of the medieval world as a collection of isolated feudal units, occasionally trading cloth at local fairs. The scale suggested by those numbers implies coordination, infrastructure, a system of trust and enforcement that could only function if there were a recognized authority behind it. An authority with the reach and the reputation to make contracts binding across distances that would take months to travel. That authority, named in the third folio, is the same authority named in the first and second, and it is named as a going concern, as an active power, as a civilization in operation at the moment of writing, in the year 1357. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the accepted history says was happening in 1357. According to the standard account, the Mongol Empire was in the process of fragmenting. The Black Death had moved through Eurasia with devastating efficiency in the decade before. Trade routes were disrupted, political authority was contested, the great cities of the Silk Road were in various states of decline or transition. Western Europe was emerging haltingly from the worst demographic catastrophe it had ever experienced. The story told is one of chaos, fragmentation, and the slow, painful reconstruction of something new from the ruins of something old. That story is not entirely false, but it is a story shaped by what survives in accessible archives, and what survives in accessible archives is what was allowed to survive. Documents that confirmed the chaos narrative were preserved. Documents that suggested a different kind of order, a different source of economic authority, had a way of ending up in private collections, in locked rooms, in vaults that do not appear on floor plans. The 1357 manuscript is one of those documents, and the economic implications of what it contains are, if the partial transcriptions are accurate, significant enough to reshape the entire origin story of modern Western finance. Here is the core argument that revisionist economic historians have been building carefully for 4 decades. The standard account of the rise of modern banking and commercial law traces its origins almost exclusively to northern Italy. The Medici, the Bill of Exchange, double entry bookkeeping, the legal frameworks developed in Venice and Florence and Genoa that eventually became the foundation of the global financial system. That account is not wrong about what happened in Italy. It is wrong about where Italy got it from. The financial instruments that appear, apparently fully formed in the records of the great Italian trading houses in the 13th and 14th centuries, did not emerge from nothing. They emerged from contact, from exposure to a more sophisticated system already operating at scale across a much larger territory. The Bill of Exchange, the letter of credit, the partnership contract with specified liability limits, the accounting practices that allowed large-scale commercial coordination across distances and time gaps. These did not spring from the genius of Florentine merchants. They were adapted, borrowed, and brought back along trade routes that ran east into territories that the official histories of European civilization prefer to describe as primitive, chaotic, or simply empty. The territory those trade routes ran through was not empty. It was administered, connected by infrastructure, by post systems, by recognized standards of weight and measure, and by legal frameworks sophisticated enough to handle complex multi-party transactions across long time horizons. The civilization that maintained that infrastructure and guaranteed the contracts that made long-distance trade possible is the civilization that appears in the 1357 manuscript. It is the civilization that appears on dozens of maps produced between the 13th and 17th centuries, maps now housed in archives across Europe, that consistently label vast stretches of Eurasia with a name that the standard history insists was merely a vague geographic designation with no political content. The maps say otherwise, the manuscript says otherwise, the financial history of Europe, read carefully against the record of what was happening in the East during the same period, says otherwise too. Consider the timeline. The Mongol expansion of the 13th century is usually described in terms of destruction, because that is what it was in the territories it moved through. But the Pax Mongolica that followed, lasting roughly from 1250 to 1350, created conditions for trade that had not existed before and would not exist again for centuries. The Silk Road thrived. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries and travellers moved across it with a freedom of passage that contemporaries found remarkable enough to record. The goods that flowed along it were not merely luxury items, they were commodities, bulk materials, the raw inputs for manufacturing processes that required reliable supply chains and predictable pricing. Reliable supply chains require contracts. Predictable pricing requires recognized standards of value. Contracts across distances require instruments of credit. All of this requires a legal and financial infrastructure that does not spontaneously exist. It is built, maintained and enforced by a political authority with the reach to make it work. The political authority that maintained it across the Eurasian landmass during the Pax Mongolica is precisely what the revisionist historians have been arguing needs to be recognized as an economic civilization in its own right. And the name that civilization carried, in the documents it left behind, and in the records of those who dealt with it, is the name that appears in 3 folios of a manuscript locked in a room with no floor plan. The suppression of this history is not a simple story of malice, though malice has played its role. It is also a story of institutional inertia, of careers built on accepted frameworks that cannot accommodate the revision without collapsing. The British Library holds documents from the early colonial period never fully transcribed. The French National Archives contain cartographic materials from the 17th century catalogued but not analysed. The State Archives of Russia hold records from before the Petrine reforms that are technically accessible and practically invisible, because the scholars who would make sense of them have been trained in frameworks that would not know what to do with what they found. The 1357 manuscript represents a particular problem because it is not a peripheral document. It is a central one, important enough to be acquired by a Vatican-adjacent institution in the 15th century, meaning someone at that level of institutional power recognized its significance. Important enough to be kept rather than destroyed, and important enough to be locked away rather than made accessible, which tells you something about the culture of information control that operates there now. The 3 folios that mention Tartaria by name are not the whole of the manuscript's significance. Researchers who have had access to partial transcriptions describe the surrounding folios as equally dense with material that contradicts the standard account. There are references to coinage systems operating in parallel with the silver-based economies of medieval Europe, backed by commodities rather than by the authority of a monarch. There are references to administrative districts whose boundaries correspond to no political unit recognized by modern historiography, but whose names recur in cartographic materials from the same period with enough consistency to suggest they were real. There are references to arbitration mechanisms to the resolution of commercial disputes through processes that assume a shared legal culture sophisticated enough to handle complex cases without reference to any single sovereign authority. That last detail is, for the revisionist economic historians, perhaps the most significant. The emergence of commercial law in Europe is treated as one of the great intellectual achievements of the medieval period. The slow construction of frameworks that allowed strangers to trust each other enough to do business across distances. but the 1357 manuscript describes commercial dispute resolution mechanisms that already exist. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Already function, and are familiar to the document's author and intended readers. The author does not explain how these mechanisms work because the author assumes the reader already knows. That assumption, again, is the tell. The civilization described in those folios was not building toward a sophisticated commercial legal culture. It already had one. The implications for the origin story of capitalism are profound. Not the shallow version of that implication, which is simply that Europeans borrowed ideas from others, though that is true. The deeper implication is structural. The financial instruments and legal frameworks that modern capitalism rests on did not emerge from the specific cultural and intellectual conditions of Renaissance Italy in isolation. They emerged from contact with a civilization that had already solved the core problems of long-distance commercial coordination, and that contact happened along routes that ran through territories that the standard history has systematically erased as the source of anything worth borrowing. The erasure was not accidental. By the 17th century, as European colonial expansion accelerated, and the ideological justification for it required a picture of the world in which Europe was the singular source of civilization and rational governance, the documentary evidence of a sophisticated Eurasian commercial civilization had become inconvenient. Maps were redrawn, archives were reorganized, political entities that had maintained the infrastructure of the old system were reframed as barbaric tribal confederations. The financial instruments that European merchants had adopted from contact with that system were quietly reassigned to European genius, and the documents that told the other story were moved into rooms that do not appear on floor plans. The 1357 manuscript is one of those documents, but it is not unique. It is one node in a network of suppressed or ignored documentary evidence that revisionist economic historians have been mapping from the outside. Every archive that has been examined has yielded something. A trade contract that does not fit the accepted chronology of commercial law. A cartographic reference to an administrative entity with no place in the standard political history. A set of accounting records implying a scale of commercial activity incompatible with the primitive backwater narrative. Taken individually, each piece can be explained away. Taken together, they describe something. They describe a civilization that was economically sophisticated, geographically vast, administratively coherent, and commercially connected to the European systems that eventually gave rise to the modern global economy. They describe a civilization whose contribution to that lineage has been systematically removed from the record. And they describe a process of removal that was deliberate and ongoing, because the documents that would confirm the picture are still being kept in places that most researchers cannot reach. The people who have gotten closest have been financial historians, researchers who study the mechanics of how economies actually function, and who recognized in the anomalies of the European commercial record the fingerprints of an external system that the standard account could not explain. They traced those fingerprints east, through the cartographic record, through the surviving trade documents, through the legal frameworks that appear in European commercial practice in the 13th and 14th centuries without clear European precedent. And they found, at the end of that trail, the same entity that appears in the 3 folios held in the room with no floor plan. There are researchers alive today who believe that the full transcription of the 1357 manuscript would constitute one of the most significant documentary finds in the history of economic scholarship. Not because it would overturn everything known about medieval European commerce, but because it would complete the picture in a way that no amount of analysis of accessible material can. It is the document that connects the sophisticated commercial practices of the Eurasian trade system to the European financial revolution in a way that is direct, dated, and undeniable. That link is in a room with no floor plan. It has been there for the better part of 6 centuries. The people who put it there knew what they were doing, and the people who keep it there now know what they are keeping. The argument that none of this matters, that the origin of financial instruments is irrelevant as long as the instruments work, misses the point entirely. The origin matters because the narrative around the origin is still doing active work. The story that capitalism is a uniquely European achievement, that the rational commercial culture underlying the modern global economy was created from whole cloth by a particular civilization, is not merely a historical claim. It is an ideological instrument. It has been used to justify a hierarchy of civilizations in which European descent is uniquely associated with the capacity for rational economic organization. That justification rests on a history that the 1357 manuscript, among other documents, reveals to be constructed rather than discovered. When the full record is available, the story will need to be told again from the beginning, not as a story of European genius borrowing from an outside tradition, but as a story of a sophisticated global commercial civilization of which Europe was one participant among several, that developed the tools of modern economic organization collectively across a much larger territory and a much longer time frame than the standard account admits. And at the center of that story, named in the contracts and the maps and the locked manuscripts, is the civilization that the standard history has spent 400 years trying to erase. It has not been erased. It is in a room with no floor plan. 3 folios mention it by name. And the people who understand what those folios say have been building the case quietly and carefully for long enough that the case now stands without the manuscript itself. The manuscript would confirm it. But the confirmation is almost beside the point now. The point is that the story was always more complicated than what was taught. The erasure was always more deliberate than it appeared. And the documents that tell the other story are still there, waiting, in vaults and locked rooms and private collections not yet fully examined. The researchers who are looking know where to look. The archives are vast. And the 1357 manuscript is not the only one. It is simply the one that has a name. The one described in enough secondary sources, in enough careful academic correspondence, in enough conversations between researchers who trusted each other enough to share what they had seen, that it is now possible to say with reasonable confidence that it exists, that it contains what the sources say it contains, and that what it contains matters in the way that inconvenient truths always matter. Not because the world will change tomorrow when everyone knows, but because the world cannot stay the same forever when enough people are paying attention. There is a particular kind of silence that gathers around suppressed knowledge. It is not the silence of ignorance which is comfortable and easily maintained. It is the silence of institutional awareness, the kind that knows exactly what it is not saying. Anyone who has spent time in the deeper stacks of major European institutions, the catalogued but uncirculated holdings, has encountered that silence. It sits in the gap between what a document implies and what the finding aid says it contains. It sits in margin notes where a 15th century archivist wrote one description and a 17th century recataloguer quietly wrote another. It sits in correspondence between institutions, the polite letters about access requests, answered with procedural delays and never quite refused and never quite granted. The 1357 manuscript has generated that silence in measurable form. Researchers who have tried to access it have encountered a consistency of non-response that is itself informative. A consistent pattern of delay, misdirection, and procedural obstacle falling just short of outright refusal is not the behavior of an institution that does not know what it has. It is the behavior of an institution that knows exactly what it has and has decided what to do with that knowledge. That decision has been renewed by each successive administration. It does not need to be written down. The silence maintains itself. Understanding why the Vatican specifically would be in possession of this document requires understanding the relationship between the medieval church and the commercial civilization the document describes. The standard history treats the church and the Mongol-descended political entities of the East as fundamentally opposed, which is true at certain moments and completely misleading as a general characterization. Papal correspondence of the 13th century includes letters to and from the courts of the major Eastern powers. Missionaries travelled east, ambassadors travelled west. The financial relationships between the Italian banking houses that served as the Church's primary financial agents and the Eastern trade system were structural, not incidental. The Church needed money to function as a political power, and that money moved through the Italian banking system along trade routes running through the territory described in the 1357 manuscript. The bankers who handled papal finances were the same bankers who handled the letters of credit that made long-distance trade with the East possible. Their account books recorded both, and when the ideological requirements of a newly assertive European identity began to demand a different account of where the commercial revolution had come from, those who managed the archives made choices about what to preserve where. The 1357 manuscript was valuable enough to keep. It was dangerous enough to keep private. Both assessments have apparently remained stable for 6 centuries. That stability is its own kind of evidence. Documents are lost. Institutions change. Priorities shift. The fact that this document has maintained both its preservation and its inaccessibility across centuries of institutional transformation suggests that the people responsible for it in each successive generation understood what they were responsible for and why. That understanding is transmitted in finding aids in private correspondence in the oral tradition of institutional memory that every large organization maintains alongside its formal records. What gets transmitted may be as simple as a notation. This is one of the ones that stays where it is. The judgment has never been reversed, and in 668 years not one of the people who has stood in that room has been willing to say publicly, with their name attached, exactly what they saw. The agreements they signed were thorough, but agreements do not explain everything. Some of what keeps people quiet is simpler than legal obligation. It is the recognition that what they saw changes the story in ways that the story is not yet ready to absorb. The story is getting closer to ready, not because the institutions have changed their position, they have not, but because the external documentary record has accumulated to the point where the manuscript is no longer necessary to make the argument. It would be confirmation, not revelation. The maps that show Tartaria as an administrative entity across multiple centuries of European cartography. The trade contracts from Italian archives referencing Eastern counterparties using legal language with no traceable European precedent. The accounting record showing financial flows at scales incompatible with the primitive economy the standard history describes. The legal texts that appear in European commercial practice in the 13th century apparently fully formed without the developmental record that genuine indigenous invention always leaves behind. All of it points in the same direction. All of it has been available for scholars willing to look. The revisionist economic historians who have built the case have not been working from hidden documents. They have been working from documents technically accessible but practically invisible, because the frameworks used to interpret them have been built to exclude the interpretation the documents support. Change the framework and the documents speak clearly. They describe a world more connected, more commercially sophisticated, and more politically complex than the standard history admits. They describe a world in which the civilization named in the 3 folios was not a barbaric anomaly, but a functioning peer of the European commercial system, and in important respects, its teacher. That reframing does not diminish European achievement, it complicates it, which is different. Complication is what honest history looks like when you follow the evidence rather than the narrative. The evidence leads to a picture of the medieval and early modern world that is richer, stranger, and more interesting than the version most were taught. It leads to a picture in which the origins of the modern global economy are genuinely global, genuinely complex, and genuinely indebted to a civilization that has been systematically written out of the record it helped create. 3 folios in a locked room say that civilization's name. They say it without explanation, without apology, without any awareness that 668 years later, the name would need to be defended. They say it as a matter of ordinary commercial record, a power recognized and dealt with by those who knew how to read a contract and honor a debt. That is all history ever is, a record of who dealt with whom, and what they owed each other, and whether they paid. The 1357 manuscript is that record for a civilization that the standard account has tried to forget. The forgetting has not worked. It never does when enough of the paper survives. The paper survives, the room exists, the 3 folios are there, and now, you know,